What's up, guys? So today we are going to be continuing in our study of Exodus. And if you haven't been with us for the last few weeks, we have been talking about the story of Moses and all of the events leading up to the deliverance of God's people who were enslaved in Egypt. There's this build up to this great plague, the greatest plague that happens. And the greatest plague, the last plague, is actually the most devastating plague. It's a plague on the firstborn. God comes down and smites and kills every firstborn son and every firstborn son of each animal of the Egyptian people. If we think back to the beginning of Exodus, we see where the context is given. You see, Pharaoh had grown scared and nervous for the people in Israel. They were growing at this rapid rate, and so what he decided to do was put them in slavery. And so he put them in slavery and made them start working hard, and he decided, okay, if they're working hard, they're not going to have time to multiply so fast. It didn't stop them. And so he literally tries to stop them from being born. And then when that doesn't work, he tries to kill them at birth. He's throwing babies into the river, right? Killing their firstborn sons. And so when God sends Moses back to Egypt, God tells Moses to speak to Pharaoh and to say, "You let my firstborn go and worship me." You see, God sees Israel as his firstborn. God sees us as his children. And so God says to let his people go and worship me, or I will take your firstborn. So it's all coming full circle. In Exodus chapter 12, if you have a Bible, I would encourage you to read Exodus chapter 12 today. This will give you lots and lots of context. But we're going to just highlight a few scriptures. So in Exodus chapter 12, verses 12 through 13, it says this: "On that same night, I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn of both people and animals. And I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you." Something wonderful that happens during this last plague, and it's called the Passover. And the Passover is actually found in verse 21 through 24. So let's just read it. "Then Moses summoned all the elders of Israel and said to them, 'Go at once and select the animals for your families and slaughter the Passover lamb. Take a bunch of hyssop, dip it into the blood in the basin, and put some of the blood on top of both sides of the doorframe. None of you shall go out of the door of your house until morning. When the Lord goes through the land to strike down the Egyptians, he will see the blood on the top and sides of the doorframe, and he will pass over that doorway. And he will not permit the destroyer to enter your houses and strike you down. Obey these instructions as a lasting ordinance for you and your descendants.'" This is the Passover. You see, the only way that God would pass over their door is if the blood of the lamb was covering it. That was the only way. It wasn't just because they were Israelites. It wasn't because they were in slavery. It wasn't because God was mad at Pharaoh. It was because the lamb's blood was on the door. Israel did not have immunity, but God had mercy on Israel. And he shared this mercy with them through the lamb's blood. So, if you don't know, we are forgetful people. We are people who forget about everything. God encourages us over and over throughout the Bible to remind ourselves of his great promises and the work he's done in our lives, and the work he's been doing in the lives of those who came before us. And so, even in this moment, we see God tell his people to remember the Passover and to honor the Passover, to remember that God freed them from slavery, freed them and delivered them. He did this through the blood of the Lamb.
Hey y'all, this week we are going through the Exodus story and Passover. We know from looking at the story of Exodus that we are sinful and rebellious people by nature. We are born with a tendency to sin against God, and it's not how God intended it for us to be, but with the fall, that's how we came to be. Yet, God still delivers us, his people. God stood up to one of the greatest ancient superpowers, Egypt, and proved he was more powerful than a pharaoh, and releases his people from the bondage of slavery, not an easy feat in the ancient world. This reveals who God is and how he cares for his people. God is a deliverer, a protector, and he's just. The way God delivers people is the same later as well with Christ. Instead of physical slavery, God delivers us from spiritual slavery, the bondage of sin. Jesus came to lead people out of sin, and God sacrificed his one and only Son to pay the price for it, just as Pharaoh had to do with the Israelite people. The difference? Pharaoh was not blameless, and God is. This made Jesus the perfect sacrifice to save all of God's creation, all of God's people. Let's read John 16, verses 25 through 28 and 33 real quick. I have said these things to you in figures of speech. The hour is coming when I will no longer speak to you in figures of speech, but will tell you plainly about the Father. In that day you will ask in my name, and I do not say to you that I will ask the Father on your behalf, for the Father himself loves you, because you have loved me, and have believed that I come from God. I come from the Father and have come into the world, and now I am leaving the world and going to the Father. And then skipping down to verse 33, it says, I have said these things to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but take heart. I have overcome the world. That last part, I have overcome the world. That's an important part. Just like God overcame Egypt, he is stating that God is freeing all of his people from the world of sin. The references Jesus makes to Exodus are not coincidence. They are intentional. Every Jew would know the story of Moses and the Israelites' freedom from Egypt. The similarities would be obvious to them. And Jesus knew that. Jesus celebrating the Passover meal with his disciples was to remind them of what God did for them in the past, and to show them what God is about to do for their future. Except the freedom won't be from physical bondage, but from spiritual one, from an eternal one. So, if sin is our spiritual chains, and God is our deliverer from these chains, then what do you need to be freed from? I want you to use this Easter season to first remember who God is. Remember what he's done for you, and remember what he's done to the people before you. And remember, God is many things, and being a deliverer is an important one. The price that Christ paid as our sacrificial lamb. Christ is our Passover lamb, and the reason we celebrate this Easter holiday. Through the blood of the lamb, we are delivered. Second, think about what it means for you to be free from sin. As a harbinger of God's loving grace, how do you remember that price Christ paid?